1 Samuel chapter 15. This is a story your heading in your Bible might say, the Lord rejects Saul as king. This is a tragic story. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a sad story where a man is rejected in his leadership because of poor choices that he makes. Why does the Bible share the story with us? So that we can learn from the story, so that we can be aware, so that we can be intentional in our relationship with God, so that we can be intentional to be men and women of integrity in our leadership, so that we do not fall or stumble. Saul has already had one mistake. Saul has already had one moment. We realized chapters earlier. I can't remember which chapter it was. I want to say it was chapter 13 where he was rebuked by Samuel in chapter 13. And then in chapter 15 now, he's going to have another moment where he just messes up. Let's just dive into the word and let's learn from it. Verse 1. Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So now listen to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. So Samuel's talking right now, but he's speaking as the prophet of the Lord. He's speaking as if it was the Lord speaking to Saul. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. God had, back in the days of Exodus, when they were in the wilderness, the Amalekites would attack the Israelites from the rear and from the sides, and they would attack the weak and the vulnerable. It's a picture of how the enemy tries to pick us off. And God was infuriated with the Amalekites in the way that they dealt with his children Israel. And he essentially said that there will always be conflict between me and the Amalekites. God is coming back now and saying, I'm going to deal with the Amalekites. Now go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. You have to understand the context of it. The Amalekites were a wicked, wicked people. They were a wicked, wicked nation. And they were like raiders. They were like pirates. And they were conniving, and they did things that really bothered the Lord. They did things that were sinful and that were wrong. And God says, do not spare them. He says, wipe them out. Not only wipe them out, everything that belongs to them. I want you to eliminate, because it's a picture of the enemy, I want you to eliminate everything that has to do with the enemy in your life. So I want you to eliminate everything of the enemy. I don't want you to keep their crops. I don't want you to leave anyone alive. I want you to eliminate it all. Wipe it out. He said, do not spare them. Put to death the men and women, the children, the infants, the cattle, the sheep, the camels, and the donkeys. Look, there's some times where God says something, and it might not be, I'm just going to shoot straight with you, it might not be how in our natural mind we would think it should be done, but he's the Lord. And it's his perfect will, and whatever God says is right and is true, and whatever God says is just. Who's the Lord's counselor? Who are we to question the Lord? If God is declaring judgment on this nation for things that they have done, for their wickedness, then he's the Lord. And Saul needs to walk this out with integrity, and Saul needs to walk out what the Lord asked him to do. It says in verse 4, so Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, go away. Leave the Amalekites so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. He basically said to a nation that was near him, look, you can stay here and you can die, or you can get away from them and you'll live. You were kind to us. God didn't send me to deal with you. It's your choice. You want to stay or you want to go? Reminds me of Sodom and Gomorrah when God came and got Lot and his family out of Sodom and Gomorrah. He said, look, you need to get out of the city. I'm about to deal with the city. If you stay here, you're going to die. Verse 7, then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. Boom, strike one. He was not to take anyone alive. Now, you might say, why did he do this? Why did he take the king alive? It was most likely custom in those days that kings did not kill kings. It was like the unspoken code. You might defeat a king, you might put them under tribute, but kings did not kill kings. And basically, if you violated that code and you killed another king, if you were ever defeated, you were going to die. It was almost like an unspoken understanding amongst the kings. He took him alive. And all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. So he had no problem wiping out the men, the women, the children, and everything else, but he kept the king alive. Why? Because in his mind, I believe this, he was thinking of his own possible future preservation. He was doubting that God would go before him, and he was doing something that would preserve himself. That's my opinion. You're free to feel differently. Verse 9. It says, but Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. All the best stuff, all the best plunder, all the real wealth, they didn't destroy that. It says that they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. Strike two. They not only preserved the king, but all the best stuff they didn't destroy as an offering to the Lord. It's a picture of like Jericho when the Israelites went into the city and God said, nothing is yours. Everything in the city belongs to me. And Achan took something in his greed, and it ended up costing him and his family their lives. Verse 10, then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. I don't know why that scripture's always kind of stuck out to me when God says, man, I really wish this would have turned out differently than it did. And it's not that God didn't know this was going to happen. God's sovereign. God sees the end from the beginning. He knew. But what I love about God is he still gives us our free will. Even though he knows what I'm going to choose, he still lets me choose. He still lets you choose. And basically what God is showing here is that God is not a robot. God has feelings. God feels. God has emotions. And God is hurting right now because of what Saul has chosen. And Samuel, who walks with the Lord and loves the Lord and feels, for the Lord and feels with the Lord and has a care and concern for Israel and Saul. It says that he's crying all night long and that he's hurting as well. And early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told Saul was gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. So when he set up a monument in his own honor, I guess that would be like the equivalent of he built a statue of himself of how great of a leader he is. He's just going. Sometimes when you get in the pool of sin, you just go right into the deep end. He's just doubling up on his prideful actions, not only resisting the Lord, but he's propping himself up. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instructions." "No, you haven't, Saul." And Samuel would say to him, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul answered, "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we destroyed the rest." Oh, you saved them to sacrifice them. Oh, okay, Saul. Gotcha. I only imagine being a fly in the wall for this. Now all of a sudden that they saved the best because they were saving the best for God, because they wanted to offer it to God. I seriously doubt that. The Bible doesn't say in total detail whether or not that's true, but I seriously doubt that. He saved the king for preservation, and he saved the best animals probably because it was something that caught their eye. And Samuel is frustrated with them. He says, "Enough," Samuel said to Saul. "Let me tell you what the Lord told me last night." "Tell me," Saul replied. "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, 'Go and completely destroy these people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out.' Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?" You pounced on the plunder. You took something that God had said was not yours. Not only did you not listen to God, you took something that God had said was not yours. "But I did obey the Lord," Saul said. "I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal." And this is one of my favorite scriptures. Samuel would reply to him, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices?" Do you think that God really cares all that much about a cattle that's burnt on the altar rather than a cattle that's killed in the city? At the end of the day, the cattle's dead. Do you think that God really delights in the burnt offering more than the obeying? One of the translations will say, "But the Lord requires obedience before sacrifice." You can't sacrifice unless you're first obedient. Basically, what Samuel was telling Saul is he's saying, Saul, you've totally missed it. You've totally missed the spirit of what God was asking for you. Here he goes on. He says, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of adultery. He said, your rebellion and your pride, he goes, it's the worst because you have rejected the word of the Lord. And because of that, God has rejected you as king. That's heavy. Verse 24, then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. He finally owns it. At this point, I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, it's pretty much too late at this point. He's already been told that he's been rejected as king, but he finally owns it. It's a picture for so many of us. God gives us opportunities to bring things in the light. We fight it, we fight it, we fight it. Then we finally have to deal with the consequences, and then we own it. I say this for myself as much as I do all of us. Why can't we just own it when God reveals to us what we've done wrong? And why can't we be the first to humble ourselves? Why can't we bring things to the light? Why don't we run to the light, learn to love the light? I violated the Lord's commands and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. There you have it. I believe it's Proverbs that says the fear of man is a snare. Might be Psalms, but it basically, one of the, either David or Solomon, basically talked about how when we're afraid of men, when we're afraid of people, it can keep us from doing what God's asked us to do. The fear of man is a snare. He said, I was afraid of the men. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. He said, forgive my sin, but also come back with me. Also come with me so I look good in front of the men. Verse 26, but Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. He tried to grab Samuel to stop him. He really so cared about how the people saw him that he wanted Samuel to go out there and act like everything was okay, even though it wasn't. He did not want the people to know what he was dealing with in his secret life, so to speak. Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human that he should change his mind. Basically, he says God is not a man that he would change his mind. God is not a man that he would lie. God is not a man. Saul replied, I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. All he cared about was his image. All he cared about was how he looked. So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Now, what I do like about Samuel is you got to remember, he's an old man. He's an old man. His sons had been rejected as the next prophets. The people didn't really like them because they dealt treacherously. It talks about the bribes they accepted. But he's an old man, and Saul hasn't followed through on God's word. And Samuel brings the hammer as this chapter comes to a close. Samuel says, bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. Agag came to him in chains, and he thought, surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women. And Samuel, the prophet, put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Samuel said, fine, Saul, you don't want to do things God's way. I'll do it. I'll do what needs to be done. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Saul was rejected as king. Saul was told that his family would not continue in the leadership of Israel. But just because he was rejected as king didn't mean that he stopped being king in that moment. We're going to begin to enter into the life of David, a man after God's own heart, one who would love the Lord. But just because David, we'll see, is anointed doesn't mean that David immediately becomes king. Saul would actually have a season where he would pursue David and try to harm David in the future and would do everything he could to try to keep his kingdom for as long as he could before he and his son would eventually die in battle and David would become king. All this to say, all the story that God shares with us, I don't believe he shares the story to shame Saul as much as he does for us to learn about the mistakes that Saul made so that we don't make those mistakes in our life. When God tells you to do something, do it. And do it to the detail. Don't do it the way you think it should be done. Do it the way that God told you to do it, even if you think it's silly. I'm reminded of the story of the man who came to the prophet and asked how he could be healed. And he said, go dip in I think it was the Jordan River 7 times. And he's like, oh, I don't want to go dip in the river 7 times. It's dirty. And one of his servants said, dude, if that's what God says will get you healed, go do it. Do it by faith. And he did it and he was healed. It's not how I think it should be done. Whether God says dip 5 times or 25 times, who cares? If God asks us to do it, let's do it. Let's not do it our way. Let's not do it culture's way. Let's not be afraid of people. Let's not be afraid of men and women. And let's not let that be a snare in our life. Let's do things God's way so that God will continue to use us, God will continue to bless us, and God will continue to go before us. Let's be intentional to do what God asks us to do. Be blessed today.